The US escalates its military operations in Yemen as the country grapples with the challenges of a fragile transition after the long-time rule of Ali Abdullah Saleh. What are the consequences of this covert war? You're watching Inside Story Americas from Washington. Hello, I'm Shihab Rattansi. For years, the US has fought that war in Yemen using drones, cruise missiles, and naval bombardment. A surge in US military activity has taken place since pro-democracy protests began in the country in 2011, according to the Bureau of Investigative Journalism. Since 2001, hundreds have been killed, dozens of them civilians. Just in the last 2 weeks, there have been 10 suspected US drone strikes, the latest on Tuesday, reportedly killing at least 12 civilians. FBI Director Robert Mueller said last week that al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, based in Yemen, is the biggest terrorist threat facing the US. Last week, the Pentagon announced that it had resumed sending troops, it said, to train Yemeni forces. The US military said it suspended such a program amid the uprising against longtime President Ali Abdullah Saleh. On Tuesday, Yemeni officials reported that American troops had been involved in a joint assault on what was said to be al-Qaeda fighters. Despite the increased focus on Yemen, al-Qaeda's presence continues to grow there. The US says there are more than 1,000 members now, more than 3 times the estimate for 2009. Washington has thrown its weight behind the current transitional government, which faces multiple challenges. It's trying to maintain a fragile consensus between those loyal to former President Saleh, opposition elements, and tribal factions. Besides al-Qaeda, the Yemeni government is faced with separate independence movements in the north and south. And then there are Yemen's social and economic problems to contend with. The UN says some 44% of Yemenis are food insecure, and in the last 2 months, unrest across the country has led to the displacement of 95,000 people. So, can the US afford to ignore Yemen's larger political and economic problems while pursuing its covert military strategy? Joining us now from New York is Jeremy Scahill, national security correspondent at The Nation magazine. Here in the studio we have David Newton, a former US ambassador to Yemen, and Robert Grenier, former top counter-terrorism official at the CIA. Robert Grenier, you wrote a very provocative article for Al Jazeera, in fact, where you suggested that the US was in danger of turning Yemen into the Arabian equivalent of Waziristan. What did you mean by that?
Well, what I mean is that in pursuing the people who seem to be hell-bent on harming Americans and their allies, we have to be very careful lest we further radicalize the people among whom they are embedded and whose goals and motivations are likely, in many cases, much more local than they are international.
But I mean, John Brennan, the counter-terrorism advisor, does assure us all that as a result of these efforts, the US is more secure and the American people are safer. Are you saying that he's misguided in that contention?
No, I'm not saying that he's necessarily misguided. I'm saying that as he and the US government pursue their objectives with vigor, we have to be very measured in the way that we go about this, because if we are too heavy-handed, if the approach is too broad, then we risk creating more enemies than in fact we are eliminating.
And that's your contention as to what the situation in Waziristan and in Pakistan is right now, then?
Yes, I think there have been many unintended consequences of the actions that we have taken in Waziristan. Now, it's very easy to point out that the fact that there are downsides to the policies that we've pursued. I'm not saying that it is easy to separate out what we would see as a positive thing, which is going after core al-Qaeda terrorists, while at the same time not inflaming others who have a similar orientation who happen to be in the same vicinity. It's very difficult to do one without doing the other, but that is the task that we're given.
There do seem to be many striking parallels between Yemen and Pakistan. First, let's take a closer look at the US drone strikes in the two countries. Since the US began its covert drone campaign in Pakistan in 2004, a reported 322 strikes have been carried out, killing around 3,000 people. In Yemen, the US has carried up to 84 drone strikes since 2001. Up to 746 have been killed there. Over the past year, the focus has appeared to shift to Yemen. In 2012, reports showed 24 US airstrikes have been carried out in Yemen, with 12 drone strikes in Pakistan. Ambassador Newton, do you share any of that unease and, I mean, that inevitable comparison that needs to be made as to the how efficacious this policy is, given the experience of Pakistan?
It is risky, and indeed there will be bad consequences if we are not careful and we start hitting innocent civilians, because everyone out there in this essence is a civilian. But I think we have to do it. I mean, we have a very dangerous suitcase bomber out there in Yemen. We've been lucky, and the first 3 attempts has failed, but the U.S. government, I think, has no choice but to really try to put an end to this, or at least to cripple it. Now, supporting the Yemeni army is a less risky way of doing it, but you could imagine the outcry if something happened and we hadn't made every effort to try to stop this man.
Jeremy Scahill, so that's what we hear all the time. Something has to be done. There is a threat in Yemen. There are people there who want to do harm to the United States and its interests. So this is absolutely one part of that strategy.
Well, you know, I recently was on the ground in Yemen, and I was one of the only journalists to make it into Zinjibar, which is a town in Abyan province that was taken over by a group called Ansar al-Sharia, which is a relatively new group that does contain some core elements of al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, but is largely a response to the corruption of the Saleh dictatorship, to the policies of the United States that have really focused almost exclusively on terrorism issue to the expense of all other issues. And what I would argue is that we are actually making America less safe in our response in Yemen right now. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. Our own policies, the drone strikes, the support for a corrupt regime, the lack of any substantial funding for civilian infrastructure, but then all the money that's needed for counterterrorism and supporting military units in Yemen that are perceived as being the Saleh family military rather than the national military, has sparked a response of blowback, where you now have a situation that people who would not have been inclined to support al-Qaeda are actually joining with AQAP in a kind of marriage of convenience to rise up against the central government. And when you kill civilians, as the U.S. strikes have, according to these reports in the past few weeks, and really since December of 2009, when Obama authorized a strike that ended up killing over 40 Bedouins in South Yemen, what you're doing is you are giving people a legitimate reason to want to fight the United States. And my fear is that we are going after a relatively small group of people, and we are in the process of attacking them militarily and killing civilians in the process, and supporting a corrupt regime, creating a much bigger pool of enemies, and enemies that are not worrying about America having McDonald's and a lot of money, but are actually concerned about the fact that their family members have been killed. I think it's a recipe ripe for disaster.
Ambassador?
I think we are indeed. I agree with much of that, and I think we are in a very difficult situation.
But if you're making it worse, it's not so much that you're in a holding pattern.
Well, you always face the alternatives. The options in this case, none of them are good. And the option of not going after these people, I think, is something that you cannot expect the U.S. government to do. But I agree entirely on the drone strikes. They have to be done when they're done very, very carefully.
Robert Grenier, I interrupted you. I'm sorry.
Sure.
Well, no, I was going to put the question to Jeremy. Jeremy, I don't disagree. In fact, I quite agree with much of what you said. On the other hand, it sounds as though your prescription would be essentially to ignore al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula.
No, I mean, I'm glad that you asked that. You know, what I heard, Bob, when I was talking to tribal leaders in the South, they were saying to me, why don't the Americans work with us? Why are the Saudis the only people that that have intelligence assets on the ground here? The reality is, and I think people in the intelligence community need to look at this, the key to resolving this issue with al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula is going to be by taking away the motivation of the tribes in the South to give them protection. If you drain that swamp, and you give an incentive to the tribes to stop harboring members of AQAP. See, they don't see AQAP as a threat to them, the tribes that is, and they feel like the United States has ignored them, has supported the dictatorship, and now is bombing, including using cluster bombs that are unexploded throughout South Yemen, that in fact they're saying, you know what, we're going to let al-Qaeda go after the United States. We'll let them operate here. So I would argue that the U.S. is ignoring and completely allowing the Saudis to take over relations with the very very people that actually could effectively and credibly confront AQAP.
Ambassador David Newton, I mean, can you see that there might be some suspicion that the Saudis should be, along with the US, should be the guardians of a transition to representative Yemeni democracy, both centrally and in the regions? So that, I mean, that this doesn't seem to be the best way of stability, at the very least.
I take that point. I think that's quite true. And Saudi-Yemeni relations have never been particularly close. But we're the two countries that has the most at stake.
Well, the Yemenis have got quite a bit at stake too, though.
Well,
So isn't that a symbiotic relationship?
Countries, yeah, the two outside countries. Yemen has such an incredibly long list of problems. It's hard to know where to start. We were saddled with dealing with a government which certainly is quite corrupt and not the kind of government we would like to have.
I guess we're going back to that idea of, I guess, a Hippocratic oath of, first doing no harm, at least not making things worse. Jeremy Scahill, I mean, you've written extensively about how the US has dealt with, it is a very difficult government. It's a government structure, rather, with lots of webs between tribespeople and factions and elements of different families and so forth. I mean, how is the US handling this? Are they doing a good job? Are they making things worse?
Well, I think that U.S. policy has made the situation worse. I actually think that we set out with an agenda to fight terrorism in Yemen and have, through our actions of supporting the Saleh regime and carrying out ill-advised bombings, particularly at crucial moments when it was the last thing we should have been doing, we've actually encouraged the spread of terrorism in Yemen and the growth of terrorist groups in Yemen. I mean, I think a real problem that we have right now, and I'd be very curious what Bob has to say about this specifically, is that I think that we have a dearth of intelligence in Yemen right now. We don't have intelligence assets, we just have technology. And the signature strikes, as they're called, that sort of striking people with drones or cruise missiles based on a pattern of life, is really, I think, speaks to the lack of real intelligence that we have on the ground. And I think it's a real crisis of intelligence. And I think that we are acting out of fear, and we're doubling down on using technology rather than real-life intelligence.
Robert Grenier, what is your sense then, with your contacts with the intelligence community? Does the US really know what it's dealing with in Yemen?
Well, the short answer to that is I don't know. There's a great deal that I don't know about our intelligence picture in Yemen right now. I suspect, however, that one of the points that Jeremy makes is quite valid as far as it goes, and that is that we are being driven by fear. As David just pointed out, we are very, very concerned lest there be a significant and successful terrorist attack on the U.S., its assets, its allies, or worse yet, the homeland, which emanates from Yemen. And that is what is driving us right now. And I think that is the key to the impatience that we're seeing right now.
Is there an inability to learn from the experience of events since 2001 then, the experience of Afghanistan, the experience of Pakistan, the experience of Iraq perhaps? I mean, we seem to be stuck in that same formula, that same template that we're now using in Yemen or Somalia or elsewhere. Is anything being learned? Is there an ability to learn from what's happened in the past there, do you think?
Well, I hope so. And in fact,
is there any evidence that it is being?
Little, unfortunately, in my view. I think that there are some important lessons which we are slowly being forced upon us in Afghanistan, for instance. And I think that going smaller, longer, and with a far more patient approach is where we're going to end up in Afghanistan, and that's what I would.
I mean, I guess we're back to your comparison with Waziristan. I mean, in that sense that, Ambassador, we have Al-Qaeda, but we also have local tribes. We have other groups, perhaps, who are more locally based and perhaps, have some alliance with Al-Qaeda. We have a government which is rather opaque, and you don't really know whether there are links between them and some of your enemies and so forth. There are family issues, and I mean, it seems to be a very similar template, and yet the US does seem to be just basically going, well, this didn't really work in Pakistan and Afghanistan, but let's do it here now. I mean, doesn't that worry you at all?
I can't believe that we haven't learned the lessons from Pakistan. But you're right, this is a hugely complex problem. Abiyan has always been a difficult place. You've had the British, you've had Marxist, violent Marxist, Islamic fundamentalists. And one of the things that we didn't quite touch on, we have to be awfully careful not to be seen taking the side of the central government against the Southerners who have real justified
a very good job at
grievances.
That, right?
It's very tough to do, but you can do. It's much better if you can support these military efforts on the ground, although they're not going to be from the Yemeni army as discriminating as you would like. well, we have a really difficult problem, but what can you do?
Jeremy Scahill, what can you do?
I wanted to add something to that. I mean, one thing that really struck me on my recent trip to Yemen was how ordinary Yemenis, a lot of ordinary Yemenis, separate the U.S.-backed counterterrorism units from their own national military. The perception of a lot of Yemenis, including Yemenis that work in the security services, at least as they expressed it to me, was that the United States built up these counterterrorism units with the express intent of going after al-Qaeda and largely abandoned supporting the traditional military. And the very units that were supposed to be fighting terrorism do nothing of the sort, instead defend the regime. So I think we've also created proxies that the Saleh regime masterfully used to defend his own regime.
But isn't there some illusion, though, between the US's interest in Yemen and those who aren't terribly keen on democracy in Yemen? Because if there was a representative democracy in Yemen, Jeremy, then the US might not be allowed to bomb wherever it wants in the country.
Well, I mean, look, this may be controversial to say, but I really think that the United States needs to get over its fear of Islamist governments or Islamic governments, because the reality is that an indigenous government that would have widespread support in many countries is not going to look like an American democracy. It's not going to look like what the neocons envision the Middle East looking like. And in many cases we have abandoned relationships with people based on our fear of their Islamic nature, rather than realizing they probably hold the key to stability in a lot of these countries in the Middle East. So I think a core problem that we're facing is a lack of actual intelligence about the culture in Yemen, about the various tribal structures, and the various sects of Islam that exist within Yemen. It's an incredibly diverse country.
For example, I mean, the Houthis in the north or the socialist separatists in the south, theoretically, I don't know whether I'm being very glib about this, would be natural allies against al-Qaeda. I mean, wouldn't they? I mean, they're either secular or they're Shia. And yet the US is siding with Saudi Arabia, which has its own agenda with at least some of these
Well, and the
factions.
Saudis bomb the Houthis regularly.
Right. I mean, there doesn't seem to be joined up thinking, perhaps, Robert Grenier.
Well, I think, and David could perhaps speak to this better than I can, but I think that we are allying ourselves with those who we think, A, have capability, and B, share some of our general goals. And I think that in some cases our support is being misused by them.
But that's just it. You've got to make an omelette. You've got to. I mean, that's what. I mean, that's acceptable. I mean, again, it's this idea of are we making things worse? Is the US making things worse? Are there alternatives to this? Is it good enough simply to say, well, what else can we do? I mean, is that really satisfactory?
We want to say, could we do it better? And I think we could do it better. It would be more discriminating. Problem with Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia, I've spent a long time in Yemen, was always part of the solution, but a big part of the problem. They introduced a lot of this fundamentalism into Yemen.
The alliance is still strong.
When you look at it from the point of view of the United States, Saudi Arabia is a far more important country to the United States than Yemen. And we have to do this in partnership, in part because Yemeni's problems are so huge and so expensive that only Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states can have any hope of bailing Yemen out.
But that's about solving the problems. That's simply about containing Yemen's problems, perhaps, and then maybe not going against
I don't think Yemen's problems are solvable, in fact. So containing them may be the best.
I can see where this is all perhaps coming from.
Well, actually, I think that's a key point. And I think we need to recognize that in some fundamental sense, the problems in Yemen are insolvable. And that the best that we can do is to contain the problem and make a certain amount of incremental progress over time.
But the argument is you're not containing it, you're making it worse.
Yeah, well, I think it is arguable, and I tend to be rather sympathetic to this view, that in trying to solve the problem once and for all and fairly quickly, we are running a very serious risk of making the problem far worse.
Jeremy Scahill, when looking at President Obama's strategy then, the ambassador talks about, okay, we could maybe be more selective about targets, but isn't President Obama going in directly the opposite direction of that, with now introducing signature strikes, follow-up strikes? Actually, just today in Jar, one of the strikes that occurred today, many of the civilians are reported to have been killed after they'd gathered where the initial strike had occurred, and then there was a follow-up strike and so forth. That doesn't seem like there's much care. I mean, it doesn't seem like there's a real process of trying to minimize the number of people being killed in these strikes that's underway right now.
Well, I mean, the first strike that we know of that President Obama authorized in Yemen was on December 17th, 2009, and it wasn't a drone strike. It was actually a cruise missile attack that was under the command authority of the U.S. Special Operations Command, and they rained down cruise missiles on this village, ostensibly to kill a bunch of al-Qaeda militants, and they end up wiping out this village. People to this day are still talking about that in Yemen and demanding compensation. The signature strikes are just, they are a totally indefensible policy, because because they show an utter lack of actual intelligence. They criminalize patterns of life rather than having evidence that someone actually is a terrorist, and they increase the likelihood that we're going to kill civilians and therefore make enemies who have a legitimate grievance against the U.S. This is classic counterinsurgency 101. Do not give the enemy an actual reason to fight you. Force them to come up with kooky ideological reasons. And yet we are giving so many Yemenis a legitimate reason to despise and loathe the United States, because all the aid they get is humanitarian cruise missiles and hellfires.
Not least, I suppose, on the fact that one of the reasons why we know about that first cruise missile strike and who was actually killed is a journalist who President Obama personally interceded to see was put in prison, or at least remained in prison.
Yeah, I mean, there's this guy named Abdullah Haider Shaya who he did work for the Washington Post, he did work for ABC News, he did work for Al Jazeera. He went to the scene, he took pictures, and long story short, he ends up getting targeted by Saleh's U.S.-backed security forces. He had interviewed Anwar al-Awlaki, the American YouTube cleric who was living in Yemen, and basically they put him in this court that was set up to go after journalists. After some tribal mediation, he was supposed to be released and pardoned from prison after being convicted of being an al-Qaeda facilitator, and President Obama personally called Ali Abdullah Saleh in February 2010 and said that the U.S. doesn't want him released from prison, and he remains in prison to this day. So it's really disturbing, the involvement of our own government in that case.
So Ambassador Newton, I mean, to your point then about at least doing this in an intelligent manner, if you feel that there are enemies to be struck, and of course we haven't even discussed legality and having to go to Congress and so forth for further permission. Can we really believe John Brennan, the counter-terrorism advisor, when he assures us that there's a careful review process, there's a high bar for action, and that we should trust them, frankly, even when journalists who are simply telling us the truth of what's going on are then President Obama personally phoned Saleh to keep him in prison when he was on the cusp of being released. I mean, surely there's some problem.
We say we have intelligence, but there are several layers going back, and the people who press the button are in Nevada, usually. So I do feel in many cases we don't have the good intelligence we need, which means to me, I don't think we can give up using the drone strikes. But we should.
But none of these arguments are about perhaps fostering true democracy, listening to what the people actually want, accepting the fault lines of Yemen, and then intelligently trying to come up with some solution. That doesn't convince you. In the end, yes. It has simply to be
but these are
just join up with the Saudis.
These are long-term goals, and we're dealing with the immediate problem. To me, the idea.
But Al-Qaeda, but in the immediate, because of the strategy, Al-Qaeda is just growing in Yemen. Again, that's the other empirical evidence that this might not actually.
Well, work. To me, the encouraging thing is going along is we're obviously helping we and the Saudis, the Yemeni army, to go after them on the ground, which makes a lot more sense.
But are you convinced that they're going after Al-Qaeda and not simply the enemies of the regime?
I think they are going after Al-Qaeda, after all, and those people, they're going after the people who are attacking them, basically. So whatever their entire motive is, this is no accident for two reasons. Number one, we are responding to the failed attempt with a bomb by stepping up our efforts. And a week from today, or a week from tomorrow, the Friends of Yemen are meeting in Riyadh. And if Yemen cannot demonstrate that it has some kind of plan to deal with these people, the people who might give a lot of money to Yemen or need to give money to Yemen are not going to be convinced that this is a worthwhile place to put their money. So if they don't crack
down even harsher, they're not going to get money for all the developmental and economic problems that they have.
The huge
and
problem.
That sounds.
But they've got to show that they can at least deal with these people in Abiyan and Jad and Sinjabar.
Robert Grenier, Donald Rumsfeld famously asked the question, are we capturing, killing or deterring and dissuading more terrorists every day than the madrasas and the radical clerics are recruiting, training and deploying against us? Do you think that question is still being asked actively, or is there just simply one template for the US to fight this war, and that's simply, well, you know, we just have to do it, there's no choice, everything else is too complex or too long term?
Well, yeah, I think that the problem is a short-term one. As David just pointed out, there are people who are actively trying to kill us right now. And when we have an opportunity to do something to thwart them, then I think that we need to do it. That does not obviate the fact that we ought to be taking a much longer-term view of all this, and we ought to be much more firmly embedded in some of these areas than we are right now.
Very briefly then, Jeremy Scahill, finally, can you see a balance being struck between those two needs of the administration, or those two strategic interests?
I think that a drone strike campaign and any kind of military bombing is going to radically undermine our ability to take steps that actually could make the United States safer and the threat, lower, the threat level lower. I don't think that these military strikes are helping at all, and I fear that they're going to actually make it all the more inevitable that we will get attacked out of Yemen. I think we're giving people a real motivation to want to join these groups in both Yemen and Somalia, and I think that's really a sober question this nation has to look at.
Jeremy Scahill, thank you very much. Robert Grenier, thank you as ever. Ambassador David Newton, thank you. And that's it from the team in Washington, D.C. for now. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter and Facebook, where you can find more information about the program. And we want to hear from you. Tell us what stories you think we should be covering. Send your ideas directly to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net.